Right now, somewhere over Iran, an aircraft is doing something no other jet in history has been able to do, with quite the same combination of reach, silence, and lethality. It penetrates one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth, carries precision weapons deep into denied territory, shares targeting data across the entire joint force in real time, and then returns to base without the enemy ever getting a clean radar lock. That aircraft is the F-35 Lightning II. It is the most expensive weapon system in the history of human civilization. It has flown combat missions over Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, Venezuela, and now Iran. It has survived withering political criticism, cost overruns that stretched into the hundreds of billions of dollars, development delays measured in decades, and nearly 30 years of controversy that followed it from the drafting tables of the early 1990s to the skies over Tehran in 2026. And through all of it, the aircraft keeps flying, keeps fighting, and keeps doing things that no other tactical aircraft on Earth can match. This is the complete story of the F-35 Lightning II. It begins with the war that is happening right now, in real time, over the skies of Iran. It goes deep into the technology that makes the aircraft what it is. It examines the production infrastructure, the training pipeline, the sustainment challenges, and the global web of operators who fly the machine. And it traces every step of the path, from the first concept sketches in Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, to the smoking wreckage of Iranian radar sites struck by an aircraft that radar could barely find. There is no other aircraft quite like this one. There is no other story in the history of military aviation quite like the story of how it was built. And there is no better time to tell that story than right now, while the aircraft is defining the outcome of a war. As of late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched the largest combined military air campaign in the modern era against Iran. On the Israeli side, the operation was designated Operation Roaring Lion. On the American side, it was Operation Epic Fury. The opening strikes on February 28, 2026, were staggering in scope. Approximately 200 Israeli Air Force jets, including F-35I Adirs and F-15s, struck roughly 500 targets inside Iran in a single night. Simultaneously, US Air Force F-35As began lifting off from land bases scattered across the Middle East, and US Navy F-35Cs launched from the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln operating in the Arabian Sea and the USS Gerald Ford in the Mediterranean. The F-35 was at the epicenter of everything. According to statements from U.S. Central Command, American forces flew more than 8,000 combat flights during Operation Epic Fury in the weeks that followed the opening strikes. The F-35 led the most dangerous missions. It penetrated Iranian air defense networks ahead of heavier bombers, suppressed surface-to-air missile systems by drawing their fire and exposing their positions, and struck hardened underground targets that no fourth-generation aircraft could have reached undetected. Iran had spent years building one of the most layered and redundant air defense architectures in the Middle East. It combined Russian-supplied S-300 surface-to-air missile batteries with domestically produced radar networks, short-range point defense systems, and increasingly capable passive infrared tracking systems that do not emit radar energy at all. Defeating that architecture, or suppressing it enough to allow other aircraft to operate in Iranian airspace, required exactly the kind of platform the F-35 was designed to be. The war did not emerge without context, and the F-35 had been building toward this moment for years. In June 2025, the United States and Israel conducted coordinated strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, in what Lockheed Martin would later reference in a public statement as Operation Midnight Hammer. In that campaign, U.S. Air Force F-35As and F-22 Raptors flew into the teeth of Iranian air defense networks ahead of B-2 Spirit strategic bombers. Their role was to suppress enemy air defenses by acting as penetrating sensors and bait platforms. They flew close enough to Iranian radar systems to draw missile fire, forcing Iranian operators to activate their tracking radars, which immediately exposed those radar positions to precision anti-radiation weapons. Once the radars were killed, the bombers flew through the resulting corridors and struck the nuclear infrastructure. The concept validated something the Air Force had been developing for years, using the F-35 not simply as a strike aircraft, but as the most advanced suppression of enemy air defenses platform in the world, a machine that could survive in the most contested airspace long enough to dismantle the defenses that kept everything else out. Then in January 2026, just weeks before the full-scale war erupted, F-35s were in combat over Venezuela. The United States conducted strikes as part of an operation targeting the Venezuelan government. F-35s worked alongside F-22 Raptors, B-1 Lancers, F/A-18 Super Hornets, and EA-18G Growlers to disable Venezuelan air defense systems. General Dan Kane credited the F-35 with disabling Venezuelan air defenses sufficiently to allow special operations helicopters to reach their target safely. The operation resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. It was a remarkable deployment of American air power, and it demonstrated the F-35's ability to serve as the spearhead of a joint force campaign in a completely different part of the world, just weeks before an even more demanding operation would begin. Operation Epic Fury, launched February 28, 2026, became the largest American air campaign in a generation. By mid-March 2026, the U.S. had struck approximately 7,000 targets inside Iran, destroyed more than 40 Iranian mine-laying vessels, and sunk 11 submarines. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stated publicly that American forces were winning decisively and that Iran's air defenses had been flattened. The F-35 was the primary instrument of that suppression. Its ability to operate in a near-invisible radar profile, penetrate enemy networks, identify and classify threat systems using its sensor suite, and then either engage those systems directly or pass targeting coordinates to other weapons, was exactly the operational concept that had justified 30 years of development investment. The war produced a series of historic firsts for the platform, some triumphant and some sobering. On March 4, 2026, the Israel Defense Forces announced that an F-35I Adirs had shot down an Iranian Yak-130 combat trainer over Tehran. The engagement was conducted at beyond visual range using long-range missiles. It was the first time an F-35 of any variant, flown by any operator in the world, had destroyed a crewed aircraft in air-to-air combat. It was also the first Israeli air-to-air kill of a crewed aircraft since November 1985, when an F-15 had downed 2 Syrian MiG-23s over Lebanon. The IDF described the engagement as a rapid response. Israeli forces had declared air superiority over Tehran on March 2nd, citing the destruction of Iranian air defense systems and command centers in the opening hours of the conflict. 3 days after that kill, on March 3, 2026, the British Ministry of Defense confirmed that a Royal Air Force F-35B had shot down a hostile drone over Jordan, marking the first time a British F-35 had destroyed any target in operational conditions. Britain had been operating F-35Bs for years at that point, but had consistently employed the Eurofighter Typhoon for actual combat missions, particularly against Houthi targets in Yemen. That changed with the 2026 conflict, as the F-35B's capabilities became essential to the coalition's mission set. Then came the event that most sharply tested the long-standing narrative of F-35 invulnerability. On March 19, 2026, a US Air Force F-35A was flying a combat mission over central Iran in the early morning hours, when it was forced to make an emergency landing at a US airbase somewhere in the Middle East. Captain Tim Hawkins, spokesman for U.S. Central Command, confirmed the landing and stated that the aircraft had landed safely and the pilot was in stable condition. CENTCOM said the incident was under investigation. 2 sources familiar with the matter told CNN the aircraft had been struck by Iranian fire. An NPR correspondent reported that the aircraft had made a hard landing and would be out of service for an extended period, suggesting significant damage. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed it had severely damaged the F-35, asserting the strike took place at approximately 2:50 in the morning local time. The IRGC released a video purporting to show the interception. Analysts debated the video's authenticity, with some suggesting it showed a genuine infrared tracking engagement and others questioning whether it was authentic. A Ukrainian news agency attributed the possible hit to Iran's Rad air defense system. Chinese analysts writing for the South China Morning Post suggested the damage may have been caused by an adapted air-to-air missile fired from the ground rather than a conventional surface-to-air system. The implications of a confirmed F-35 hit by Iranian forces were significant. Since its combat debut in May 2018, no F-35 had ever been struck by enemy fire in 8 years of active combat operations across multiple theaters. The aircraft had accumulated a reputation for a kind of practical invulnerability in contested airspace that had become one of its defining characteristics. Iran had studied the F-35 and its known vulnerabilities for years. The most exploitable characteristic is the aircraft's infrared signature. The F-35 stealth design dramatically reduces its radar cross-section to roughly the size of a golf ball at X-band frequencies by some estimates, compared to approximately 5 square meters for an F-16 and 25 square meters for an F-15. But infrared stealth is harder. The F-135 engine produces enormous quantities of heat, and while the aircraft's exhaust system is designed to suppress and shape the infrared signature, it cannot eliminate it entirely. A fighter aircraft traveling at high speed through the atmosphere also generates aerodynamic heating from skin friction, particularly on the leading edges of the wings and fuselage, producing additional infrared emissions. Iran has developed passive infrared air defense systems that detect aircraft by these heat signatures without transmitting any radar energy themselves. Because they are purely passive, the F-35's electronic warfare suite, which is designed to detect, locate, and jam adversary radar emissions, cannot find them. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, using Iranian-supplied passive tracking technology, had previously demonstrated success engaging advanced aircraft using this approach, and the same principle appears to have been employed against the F-35 in Iran. The broader operational picture of the conflict by mid-March 2026 provided important context. The U.S. had lost other aircraft in the war as well, though most losses were not attributed to direct enemy action before the March 19 F-35 incident. 3 F-15E Strike Eagles were destroyed on March 1 in a friendly fire incident involving a Kuwaiti F-A-18, with all 6 crew members ejecting and being safely recovered. A KC-135 aerial refueling tanker crashed in western Iraq on March 12, killing 6 American airmen. By mid-March, the U.S. had lost at least 12 MQ-9 Reaper drones across the conflict, including 9 shot down by Iranian forces. At least 13 U.S. service members had been killed in total and roughly 200 wounded. Against this backdrop, the F-35's emergency landing, while significant, was one element in a complex picture of a war that was extracting a genuine cost in American lives and hardware, while also delivering results at a scale and tempo that no previous air campaign had matched. The F-35 fleet that was executing this campaign had grown dramatically in recent years. Lockheed Martin delivered 191 F-35s in 2025, a production record, surpassing the previous single-year high of 142 aircraft. Annual production was running at a pace 5 times faster than any other Allied fighter currently in production. The September 2025 contract for production lots 18 and 19, worth approximately $24.3 billion in combination, covered 296 additional aircraft, including jets for the Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, cooperative program partners, and foreign military sales customers. The average airframe price across those lots worked out to just under $82 million per aircraft, not including the engine. As of early 2026, the global F-35 fleet numbered close to 1,300 aircraft operated by 12 nations. The program had recorded over 1 million cumulative flight hours. By mid-2025, the 3,000th F-35 pilot had graduated from the training pipeline. Naval Air Station Lemore's Lieutenant Austin Haney completing his F-35C qualification and earning a milestone that the program proudly publicized. The training infrastructure supporting the global fleet is itself a significant enterprise. The first F-35 Integrated Training Center, also known as the F-35 Schoolhouse, opened at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida in 2012. Luke Air Force Base in Arizona opened its F-35A training facility in 2014, and the first international student from the Royal Norwegian Air Force began training there in 2015. The F-35B training facility at Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort in South Carolina opened shortly before the Marine Corps declared initial operational capability in 2015. In 2024, F-35 foreign military sales customers began training at Ebbing Air National Guard Base in Arkansas, expanding the training footprint to accommodate the growing number of nations entering the program. By mid-2025, over 688 pilots and 261 maintainers from 12 nations had graduated through the F-35 training system, with instruction being provided at more than 30 bases globally. The training devices used are sophisticated full mission simulators that accurately replicate the aircraft's hardware and software environment, and Lockheed Martin has been connecting simulators across borders so that Allied pilots can conduct large force training exercises together without the expense of actual flight operations. In July 2025, Italy announced plans to create the first F-35 fighter pilot training school outside the United States, to be located in Sicily, reflecting the depth of Italy's commitment to the program as a Tier 2 partner. To understand why the F-35 is capable of doing what it is doing over Iran, you have to understand what the aircraft actually is at a technical level. The F-35 Lightning II is not simply a faster or better armed version of what came before it. It represents a fundamentally different approach to air combat, one in which the pilot's ability to understand and dominate the battlespace takes precedence over raw kinematic performance, and in which the aircraft's survivability comes primarily from not being found rather than from being able to outmaneuver whatever tries to kill it. The aircraft exists in 3 distinct variants that share approximately 20% of their parts in practice, far less than the 70 to 90% commonality that the program originally projected. The F-35A is the conventional takeoff and landing version, the most numerous variant, and the one flown by the US Air Force and the majority of international partners. It is aerodynamically the cleanest of the 3, carries the most internal fuel, and is the only variant with a fixed internal gun, the 25mm GAU-22, a 4-barrel rotary cannon built into the left wing root. It can sustain 9G maneuvers, which is the maximum structural limit that the human body can tolerate in a modern fighter, and, in aerobatic terms, it is significantly more capable than its compact, slightly portly appearance would suggest. Early criticism that the F-35 was hopelessly outmatched in close-range air combat by aircraft, like the F-16, was based partly on a leaked test report from 2015 that described early Block 2B software limitations, not the aircraft's fully developed combat configuration. As the software matured and weapons employment expanded, F-35s consistently demonstrated the ability to dominate F-15s and other fourth-generation aircraft in simulated combat, including in beyond visual range engagements, where the combination of stealth and sensor fusion allowed the F-35 to see and shoot first without being effectively targeted in return. The F-35B is the short takeoff and vertical landing version, designed around the U.S. Marine Corps requirement for an aircraft that could operate from amphibious assault ships and austere forward operating bases without conventional runways. The engineering required to give a supersonic stealth fighter the ability to hover and land vertically is genuinely remarkable. Behind the cockpit, occupying space that the other 2 variants use for additional fuel, is a large shaft-driven lift fan. The fan has a diameter of roughly 51 inches, roughly the width of a large office desk, and is connected through a drive shaft and clutch system to the main engine. In conventional flight mode, the clutch is disengaged, and the lift fan is simply a heavy inert cylinder inside the fuselage. When the pilot transitions to short takeoff and vertical landing mode, the clutch engages, diverting power from the engine's low-pressure compressor to spin the lift fan. Simultaneously, a three-bearing swivel duct assembly below the main engine rotates the primary exhaust nozzle downward, directing the engine's main thrust toward the ground. Roll control in hover is provided by reaction control jets, essentially small compressed air nozzles in the wingtips that provide lateral authority when aerodynamic control surfaces are ineffective at zero airspeed. The combination of downward thrust from the lift fan and downward thrust from the vectored engine exhaust, with roll and pitch control from the reaction control system, allows the aircraft to hover and land on a surface no larger than a basketball court. The system works. It worked in the laboratory, it worked in the demonstrator aircraft, and it has worked in thousands of operational flights from ships and forward bases. But the lift fan comes at cost. It reduces the aircraft's internal fuel volume compared to the F-35A, shrinking the combat radius. It constrains the dimensions of the internal weapons bays, because the wide fuselage cross-section needed to house the fan leaves less lateral room for weapons carriage. It adds significant weight, and it adds mechanical complexity that requires additional maintenance attention. The F-35B's weapons bays are roughly 14 inches shorter than the F-35A's, which means the largest bomb the B model can carry internally is the GBU-32 1,000-pound variant of JDAM, rather than the GBU-31 2,000-pound weapon that fits in the A and C variants. Despite all of this, for the Marine Corps, the F-35B is transformative. It replaced the aging AV-8B Harrier with an aircraft that is supersonic, stealthy, and capable of operating the same sensor suite and sharing the same data link as every other F-35 in the global fleet. It turned amphibious assault ships that had previously been limited to helicopter and Harrier operations into genuine power projection platforms capable of executing fifth-generation strike missions. The F-35C is the carrier variant, built for the U.S. Navy and certain Marine Corps units that operate from aircraft carriers. It has the largest wingspan of the three variants, with the wings spanning approximately 53 feet compared to 35 feet for the A and B models. Those larger wings fold for storage on carrier decks and in hangar bays. They produce more lift at lower speeds, which is critical for approaching a carrier deck at a controlled speed while carrying weapons and fuel, a maneuver that demands tight airspeed tolerance to catch the arresting wire. The airframe is substantially reinforced throughout compared to the other variants, because the loads of repeated catapult launches and arrested landings far exceed anything encountered in conventional aircraft operations. The tailhook, arresting wire engagement system, and the landing gear are all designed to withstand those loads repeatedly over the aircraft's service life. In exchange for all of this additional structural weight and the extra wing area, the F-35C gains the largest internal fuel capacity of the three variants, giving it a combat radius estimated at over 1,200 kilometers. In the Iran conflict, this extended reach allowed F-35Cs operating from the Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea to strike targets throughout Iran without the tactical constraints that limit shorter-legged aircraft. All three variants are powered by the same fundamental engine, the Pratt & Whitney F-135 turbofan, which is the most powerful single turbofan engine ever installed in a production fighter. The F-135 traces its lineage directly to the F-119 engine developed by Pratt & Whitney for the F-22 Raptor program, sharing the same core turbomachinery architecture but adapted for a single-engine installation in the F-35 rather than the F-22's twin-engine layout. In the F-35A configuration, the F-135PW100 produces approximately 43,000 pounds of thrust in maximum afterburner, with a dry military power rating somewhat lower. The F-35B uses the F-135PW600, which is modified to drive the lift fan's power takeoff shaft through the clutch system and includes the three-bearing swivel nozzle assembly. The F-35C uses the F-135PW400, which is essentially similar to the -100 but has been adapted for naval carrier operations, including saltwater corrosion resistance, and the specific thermal management demands of carrier environments. The engine debate that surrounded the F-35 program for years deserves extended attention because it consumed enormous political and financial energy. Beginning in the mid-2010s, there was a sustained effort to develop a next-generation adaptive cycle engine through the Adaptive Engine Transition Program, which funded prototype development by both Pratt & Whitney and General Electric Aerospace. The adaptive cycle concept was genuinely innovative. Instead of a conventional two-spool turbofan, the adaptive engine uses 3 streams of air, a hot core stream for thrust, a conventional bypass stream, and a third adaptive stream that can be routed either to provide additional cooling or to generate additional thrust depending on what the mission demands. GE's XA100 prototype claimed to offer 20% more thrust and 30% greater range than the F-135. Pratt developed its own AETP prototype, the XA101, though the company consistently argued that upgrading the existing F-135 was the better path for the F-35 program. The debate came to a head in March 2023 when Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall announced that the Pentagon would not move forward with a new adaptive engine for the F-35. The decision came down primarily to cost and compatibility. Developing a new engine would cost several $billions. More critically, the adaptive engine designs were primarily optimized for the F-35A, and adapting them to the F-35B's STOVL requirements and the F-35C's carrier requirements proved technically problematic and potentially impossible for the B model. Since the Navy and Marine Corps had little interest in an engine that would only work in the Air Force variant, the program faced the prospect of creating a unique propulsion solution for one service, while the other two continued with the F-135. The cost of that approach, combined with the complexity of maintaining 2 different engine types in the fleet and the interoperability consequences for Allied operators, made it untenable. The chosen alternative was the F-135 Engine Core Upgrade, a program that improves the existing engine's performance and thermal management without replacing it entirely. Pratt & Whitney conducted a successful preliminary design review in July 2024 and targeted a critical design review for mid-2025. The ECU is expected to increase the engine's range and thrust by approximately 7% and double its thermal management capacity, which is critically important for enabling the Block 4 avionics upgrades that place enormous cooling demands on the engine's power extraction systems. The ECU is projected to enter service in 2029 and will be compatible with all 3 variants, maintaining the fleet commonality that makes the program economically viable. In August 2025, Pratt received a $2.88 billion contract for 141 F-135 engines as part of Production Lot 18, with each engine priced at approximately $20.4 million. The technologies developed through the AETP program were not entirely wasted. They are feeding directly into the next-generation adaptive propulsion program, which is developing power plants for the 6th-generation next-generation air dominance program that will eventually fly alongside F-35s in future conflicts. The F-35's top speed of Mach 1.6 at altitude represents a deliberate design choice rather than a technical limitation that could not be overcome. Designing a faster aircraft was technically possible, but achieving higher speeds would have required a different airframe shape, different inlet geometry, and different structural materials that would have compromised the stealth design, increased weight, or added cost. The program's designers determined that in an era of long-range missile engagements and dense surface-to-air missile networks, the speed advantage of Mach 2 versus Mach 1.6 mattered less than the survivability advantage of being nearly undetectable. The service ceiling of 50,000 feet and the combat range of approximately 380 miles on internal fuel for the F-35A reflect a similar design philosophy of prioritizing operationally relevant performance over headline-grabbing specifications. The stealth characteristics of the F-35 deserve a more technical explanation than is usually given in popular accounts. The aircraft's radar cross-section in the frontal aspect, The most important aspect, because it is where incoming threats typically approach from, is frequently cited as being roughly equivalent to a golf ball in radar reflective area. Various published estimates place the frontal radar cross-section at around 0.005 to 0.015 square meters. For context, a conventional fighter like the F-15 has a frontal radar cross-section of approximately 25 square meters, and an F-16 is roughly 5 square meters. The F-22 Raptor, which was designed from the outset with all aspects stealth as its primary requirement, has an even smaller cross-section than the F-35, estimated at 0.0001 to 0.0002 square meters in some accounts, roughly equivalent to a marble in reflective area. The F-35 stealth is optimized primarily for the frontal aspect and somewhat less effective at other angles, particularly from the rear, where the engine exhaust nozzle creates a relatively large radar return that engineers reduced but could not eliminate without adding cost and complexity that the program could not afford. The stealth shaping of the aircraft works through several mechanisms simultaneously. The aligned edges of the airframe, meaning all the sharp edges, are oriented to reflect radar energy in a small number of specific directions rather than back toward the transmitting radar, are perhaps the most fundamental element. If you examine the F-35 carefully, you notice that every edge, the wing leading and trailing edges, the inlet lips, the edges of the weapons bay doors, the edges of the landing gear doors, all share the same small set of angles. Radar energy striking any of these edges is reflected away from the radar receiver rather than back toward it. The radar-absorbing material that covers the aircraft's surface, the specialized gray coating that is one of the U.S. military's most closely guarded technological secrets, attenuates incoming radar signals by converting their electromagnetic energy into heat rather than reflecting it. The internal carriage of weapons and fuel eliminates the large radar returns that would be created by external pylons and stores. The shape of the engine inlet hides the highly radar-reflective rotating fan blades of the F-135 engine by forcing radar energy to bounce multiple times inside the S-curved inlet duct before it can reach the fan, with each bounce attenuated by radar-absorbing material on the duct walls. The radar-absorbing coating is not simply paint. It is a specialized material with specific electromagnetic properties applied in precise thicknesses that must be maintained carefully to remain effective. Even small defects, chips, scratches, or delamination of the coating can create radar returns that degrade the aircraft's stealth characteristics. This is one of the primary reasons that maintaining F-35 stealth performance requires significantly more maintenance labor per flight hour than conventional aircraft. Maintainers must regularly inspect the coating and repair any defects before the aircraft flies again. In austere forward-deployed environments, with limited facilities and equipment, this maintenance demand creates real operational challenges. At the core of the sensor package is the AN/APG-81 Active Electronically Scanned Array Radar, built by Northrop Grumman. This is the most advanced fire control radar ever installed in a production fighter aircraft. An active electronically scanned array consists of thousands of individual transmit-receive modules distributed across a fixed antenna face. Each module is a miniaturized radar element that can transmit and receive independently. By varying the phase relationships between the signals from different modules, the system can electronically steer the radar beam in any direction within the antenna's coverage volume almost instantaneously, without any mechanical movement. This electronic agility enables capabilities that simply cannot be achieved with a conventional mechanically scanned array. The APG-81 can perform multiple simultaneous functions that no previous fighter radar could manage. It can execute a long-range air-to-air search scan while simultaneously producing a synthetic aperture radar ground map with resolution high enough to identify individual vehicles, while also performing electronic attack functions against adversary radar systems, all at the same time and without any perceptible degradation of any individual function. The radar's air-to-air mode supports multiple target track while scan operations at ranges exceeding 80 nautical miles, meaning it can track numerous contacts simultaneously while continuing to search for additional threats. Its low probability of intercept modes allow it to transmit in brief, rapidly frequency-hopping bursts that are extremely difficult for adversary electronic warfare systems to detect or jam. The radar's electronic attack capability allows it to direct focused, high-power radar energy at specific adversary electronic systems to interfere with their operation. The radar synthetic aperture mode is particularly powerful for strike missions. By exploiting the aircraft's movement through the air to effectively simulate a much larger antenna aperture than the physical radar hardware actually has, the SAR mode can produce ground maps with resolution comparable to optical photography from standoff ranges. The pilot can examine the terrain ahead of the aircraft, identify a specific building within a complex, and designate it as a target without ever entering visual range. For precision strike missions against hardened or concealed targets, this capability is invaluable. The distributed aperture system consists of 6 infrared cameras embedded at precisely calculated positions around the aircraft fuselage. Each camera is small and low profile, creating essentially no additional radar cross-section. Together they cover the entire sphere around the aircraft with no gaps or blind spots. The imagery from all 6 cameras is processed by a dedicated high-speed computer that stitches the images together into a seamless spherical infrared picture and projects it onto the pilot's helmet visor. This means that when the pilot looks down toward the cockpit floor, the helmet projects an infrared image of the ground below the aircraft, as seen by the cameras on the underside of the fuselage. If the pilot tilts their head to look through the side of the aircraft, they see an infrared image of the sky beside them. Looking backward through the tail, they see the sky behind them. The aircraft becomes transparent to its pilot. In night operations, the DAS completely eliminates the need for night vision goggles. The pilot's entire spherical field of view is covered by calibrated infrared imagery, regardless of which direction they look. During daylight operations, the system supplements the pilot's natural vision with infrared data about heat sources that are otherwise invisible. For missile warning, the DAS is among the fastest and most comprehensive systems in existence. When an adversary launches a surface-to-air missile or fires an air-to-air missile at the F-35, the DAS detects the heat bloom of the motor ignition regardless of which direction the threat comes from, and alerts the pilot within a fraction of a second. The alert includes a directional cue in the helmet display, pointing toward the threat, enabling an immediate response. The electro-optical targeting system is the F-35's precision targeting and reconnaissance sensor. It is built by Lockheed Martin, the same company that builds the aircraft, and is fully integrated into the fuselage with no external protuberances. The EOTS aperture is located on the lower forward fuselage beneath a faceted sapphire glass window. Sapphire is used rather than conventional glass or polycarbonate because of its exceptional hardness and its optical properties. It protects the sensor optics from damage by bird strikes and foreign object debris, while transmitting infrared and visible light wavelengths with minimal distortion. The sapphire window's shape and material produce essentially no radar return, preserving the aircraft's stealth profile. The EOTS combines forward-looking infrared with infrared search and track, laser rangefinding, and laser target designation in a single integrated package. The forward-looking infrared mode provides a thermal image of the scene ahead, allowing the pilot to detect targets by their heat signatures against the thermal background of the terrain. At long range, the high-resolution infrared imagery allows positive identification of specific target types before the aircraft enters a weapons employment envelope. The infrared search and track mode enables the system to passively detect and track targets at extended ranges without any radar emission, exploiting the target's own infrared signature. This is the same physical principle that Iran's passive air defense systems use against the F-35, and the F-35 can use it right back against adversary aircraft and missiles. The laser rangefinder provides extremely precise distance measurements to targets, enabling accurate weapons delivery calculations. The laser designator marks targets for laser-guided munitions, either weapons carried by the F-35 itself or weapons delivered by other aircraft that the F-35 is supporting as a designator platform. The Communications, Navigation, and Identification Suite built by Northrop Grumman is the system that makes the F-35 a network node rather than merely an aircraft. Using software-defined radio architecture, the CNI implements all of its radio functions in software that can be updated remotely rather than in fixed hardware circuits. This means that as communication standards evolve, as new encryption algorithms replace old ones, and as new data link protocols are adopted by allied forces, the F-35's radios can be reprogrammed to support them without any physical modification to the hardware. For an aircraft that will still be flying in 2070, this software-defined flexibility is not a luxury but a survival requirement. The CNI suite supports Link 16, the standard NATO tactical data link used by aircraft, ships, and ground stations across the alliance. On Link 16, every F-35 in a formation continuously broadcasts its own position, altitude, velocity, and sensor tracks to all other Link 16 users in the network, and receives the same information from them. The fused picture of the battle space that results is available to every platform connected to the link simultaneously. A carrier group 100 miles away can see what the F-35 is seeing over a target. A ground commander can see the airborne picture. A B-2 bomber flying at 50,000 feet from a different direction can receive the F-35's targeting data and use it to guide its own weapons without ever illuminating the target with its own sensors. The F-35 also supports the Multifunction Advanced Data Link, a directional, encrypted, low probability of intercept communication system specifically designed for stealth aircraft to communicate with each other without broadcasting detectable signals omnidirectionally. MADL allows F-35s and F-22s to share tactical data in real time without compromising their low observable profiles. In a contested environment where omnidirectional radio transmissions can give away position and be jammed, the directional nature of MAL is critically important. The helmet-mounted display system is the pilot's primary interface with the entire sensor and weapons system. The helmet contains high-resolution display optics, a sophisticated tracking system that knows precisely where the pilot is looking at any moment, and the electronics to merge sensor imagery with flight and weapons data and project it all onto the visor in a way that appears to be correctly positioned in three-dimensional space regardless of head orientation. The engineering challenges of producing this helmet were among the most difficult in the entire program. The core problem is latency. When the pilot moves their head, the displayed imagery must update in real time. Any perceptible lag between head movement and display update creates a disorienting disconnect between what the pilot physically experiences and what they see, and in dynamic flight, this can be genuinely incapacitating. The distributed aperture system must capture, process, stitch together, and project 6 infrared images onto a moving visor in a time measured in milliseconds. Early versions of the HMDS failed this requirement. The image processing was too slow, the latency was too high, and pilots found the system difficult to use in demanding flight conditions. The issue required fundamental redesign of the video processing pipeline rather than incremental improvement, and consumed years of engineering effort and program schedule. The production version of the helmet, after all the painful iterations, is now the most capable piece of personal equipment ever worn by a combat pilot. The ability to cue weapons simply by looking at a target and designating with a switch removes a fundamental constraint of fixed forward-facing sensors. Weapons can be launched against targets that are not in front of the aircraft, including targets directly to the side, below, or in extreme cases almost directly behind, using the off-bore sight engagement capability enabled by the helmet. This is a qualitative advantage in close-range air combat that was previously unavailable in fighter aircraft without dedicated helmet cueing systems. The cockpit's large panoramic touchscreen display replaced the complex instrument panels of older aircraft with a single configurable interactive surface. The pilot can arrange the information presented on the display in whatever configuration is most useful for the current mission phase. During ingress to a target, they might display a moving map with the planned route, threat zones, and waypoints. During the targeting phase, they switch to an EOTS imagery view. During an air-to-air engagement, they display the fused air picture with threat tracks and weapons envelope information. The display can also be configured to show multiple information types simultaneously in a split layout. The Central Mission Computing System and the sensor fusion software that run on it are the intellectual heart of the aircraft. The Block 3F software that governed the aircraft through its early combat years contained 8.6 million lines of code running on integrated core processors. The technology refresh 3 hardware upgrade that enabled Block 4 capabilities increased the computing power available to this software by roughly 20 times, opening up capabilities that the previous hardware could not execute in real time. The TR3 hardware includes new display modules, new core processing modules, and expanded high-speed memory, all housed in a new modular architecture that will be easier to upgrade in the future than the previous integrated design. Block 4 encompasses over 75 major capability upgrades across all 3 variants. Beyond the new AN/APG-85 radar and enhanced electronic warfare capabilities, Block 4 integrates a new generation of weapons and adds classified capabilities that have not been publicly described. The Sidekick Weapons Bay adapter that is part of Block 4 allows the F-35A and F-35C to carry 6 AIM-120 AMRAAMs internally instead of 4, by using a dual rail rack in the outboard base station. This increases internal air-to-air magazine capacity by 50% and brings the F-35A and F-35C's internal air-to-air firepower to parity with the much larger and more expensive F-22 Raptor. Block 4 also adds the GBU-53B Stormbreaker glide bomb, a highly capable weapon that can select between infrared, millimeter wave radar, and semi-active laser guidance depending on conditions, allowing it to engage moving targets in all weather. The AGM-88G Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile Extended Range gives the F-35 an internally carried weapon specifically optimized for destroying adversary radar systems, with the additional capability to continue to the last known position of a radar even if it stops emitting. The F-35 achieved nuclear weapon certification in October 2023 when the F-35A received qualification to carry the B-61 Mod 12 guided gravity bomb. This milestone completed a nuclear capability development effort that had been ongoing since the aircraft entered service, and it made the F-35A the primary delivery vehicle for U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in NATO. The B-61 Mod 12 is a modernized version of the B-61 gravity bomb family, incorporating a precision-guided tail kit that allows the weapon to be delivered with exceptional accuracy from a standoff release point. The guided delivery allows military planners to achieve the same military effect with a smaller yield weapon, which has important implications for civilian casualty reduction and collateral damage avoidance. As of 2026, F-35 at Volkel Air Base in the Netherlands are performing the nuclear sharing mission, with Belgium, Italy, and Germany all transitioning from aging F-16s and Tornadoes to F-35. As for this role, the UK Royal Air Force is developing its own nuclear-capable F-35A capability, and in July 2025, B-61 nuclear weapons were redeployed to RAF Lakenheath, the first time since 2008, in anticipation of F-35A nuclear certification at that base. The weapons the F-35 carries reflect the aircraft's dual emphasis on stealth strike and air superiority. In the standard air-to-ground stealth configuration for the F-35A and F-35C, the aircraft carries 2 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions internally, each weighing 2,000 pounds, along with 2 AIM-120 AMRAAMs for self-defense. This is a substantial strike payload for an aircraft that creates essentially no radar return in this configuration. For air superiority missions in stealth mode, the F-35A now carries 6 AIM-120s with the Sidekick adapter, giving it genuinely formidable air-to-air firepower without sacrificing the low observable profile that keeps it alive in contested airspace. When the adversary air defense network has been sufficiently suppressed and stealth is no longer the primary survival mechanism, the aircraft breaks out its external pylons. The F-35A has 10 total weapon stations, and a fully loaded beast mode configuration can carry up to 22,000 pounds of ordnance. External carriage options include the AGM-158 Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, the AGM-158C Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile for maritime strike missions, the AGM-88G for radar killing, and the complete range of precision-guided bombs, including cluster munitions and penetrating weapons for hardened targets. A maximum external air-to-air configuration carries 8 AIM-120s and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders, a magazine that can engage numerous adversary aircraft simultaneously in a multi-axis threat environment. The Joint Strike Missile is an important addition to the F-35's weapons inventory that is directly relevant to its current Iran operations. The JSM is a low observable cruise missile, jointly funded by Norway and Australia, and developed by Kongsberg Defence. In June 2024, the US Air Force awarded its first JSM contract to Kongsberg, worth $141 million for production missiles. 2 JSMs can be carried internally in the F-35A and C, preserving the aircraft's stealth profile, with up to 4 more on external pylons. The missile is designed to engage both land and maritime targets at ranges exceeding 100 nautical miles, using a combination of GPS, terrain reference navigation, and an infrared seeker for terminal guidance. Its low observable design makes it difficult to intercept, even after it is released from the aircraft. The operating costs of flying the F-35 are genuinely high and represent one of the most challenging long-term problems the program faces. The cost per flight hour for the F-35A is estimated at various points between $35,000 and $42,000, depending on methodology and which year's data is used. This compares unfavorably to the F-16's cost of roughly $22,000 to $25,000 per hour, and the F/A-18 Super Hornet at approximately $30,000. The disparity reflects the F-35's extraordinary technical complexity. The aircraft requires approximately 13 maintenance work hours for every hour it spends in the air. A legacy F-16 requires roughly 5 maintenance hours per flight hour. An F-15 requires 6 to 8. The difference reflects not just the F-35's greater system complexity, but the specialized knowledge and proprietary diagnostic equipment needed to maintain its stealth coding, sensor systems, and software-intensive avionics. Fuel costs alone are substantial. The F-135 engine burns approximately 1,479 gallons of JP8 per hour in standard cruise conditions, translating to thousands of dollars per hour at current military fuel prices before a single maintenance action is performed. The logistics management system that supports F-35 operations evolved through a painful transition from the original Autonomic Logistics Information System to its successor, the Operational Data Integrated Network. ALIS was intended to be a revolutionary logistics concept, continuously monitoring the aircraft's systems during flight and providing maintainers with real-time health data, supply chain management, mission planning support, and comprehensive administrative functions. In practice, it was deeply troubled. The system generated excessive false maintenance alerts that triggered unnecessary corrective actions. Data transferred between Lockheed Martin and the services was sometimes corrupted. The user interface was clumsy, and the hardware was perpetually behind the commercial state-of-the-art. Early versions had cybersecurity vulnerabilities that created risks across the entire international fleet, sharing the same system. The Defense Department's Inspector General found that ALIS-related problems were costing approximately $55 million per year to resolve. Between 2015 and 2018, the DoD spent $303 million in additional labor to bring ALIS-tracked parts up to the contract specifications they were supposed to meet automatically. The replacement system ODN was designed from the beginning as a government-led effort rather than a contractor proprietary system. It was developed with contributions from the Air Force's Kessel Run Software Development Unit, the 309th Software Engineering Group, and the Naval Information Warfare Center, alongside Lockheed Martin and Pratt & Whitney. Odin is built on modern software development practices, with regular update cycles and a user-centered design philosophy that ALIS lacked. The transition from ALIS to Odin was neither quick nor easy. But by 2022, Odin had reached full operational capability, and the problems that had plagued ALIS were progressively being resolved. The projected life-cycle sustainment cost of the F-35 program represents a severe long-term affordability challenge that the Government Accountability Office has reported on for many years. Estimates of the total operating and sustainment cost over the program's 66-year operational life have risen from $1.11 trillion in 2012 to $1.27 trillion, and continuing upward in subsequent assessments. By the mid-2030s, when the fleet reaches its planned maximum size, the GAO projected an annual gap of approximately $6 billion between what sustainment will cost and what the three services projected they could afford. The services will face tens of billions of dollars in sustainment costs that exceed their projected budgets during the peak operational years of the program. This is not a theoretical future problem. It is a structural financial challenge that will require either sustained budget growth for aviation sustainment, reductions in other defense programs to free up funding, reductions in the F-35 fleet size below planned quantities, or some combination of all three. The global expansion of the F-35 enterprise has been one of the program's genuine success stories amid the financial difficulties. 12 nations currently operate the aircraft. The United Kingdom has committed to 138 F-35Bs, split between the Royal Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm. Italy operates both F-35As and F-35Bs, with the nation's assembly line at Cameri producing jets not only for the Italian Air Force and Navy, but also for other customers. Japan has committed to purchasing 147 F-35s, including both the A and B variants, planning to operate F-35Bs from modified helicopter destroyers that will function as light carriers. Australia has received the full complement of 72 F-35, as ordered, operating 3 combat squadrons from bases in New South Wales and the Northern Territory. Norway completed its order of 52 F-35As, replacing the F-16 entirely and fielding the F-35 for NATO Quick Reaction Alert duties. Denmark ordered 27 F-35 as in 2016 and later decided to purchase an additional 16 aircraft in October 2025. Canada committed to 88 F-35 as to replace its CF-18 Hornet fleet. Belgium ordered 34 F-35As, which will also carry the NATO nuclear sharing mission. Poland ordered 32 F-35As. Switzerland ordered 36 F-35As after abandoning earlier plans for the FA-18. Greece ordered 20 F-35As. Finland, Germany, Czech Republic, Romania, and Singapore have placed orders. The production lines at Fort Worth, Texas, Cameri, Italy, and Nagoya, Japan, are collectively building aircraft for this enormous global customer base. Turkey's exclusion from the program remains one of the more dramatic episodes in its procurement history. Turkey had been a Tier 3 development partner, contributing to program costs and expecting to receive 100 F-35s. In July 2019, the United States formally removed Turkey from the program after Ankara took delivery of the Russian S-400 air defense system. The concern was that Russian technicians operating the S-400 in Turkey would have the opportunity to study how the F-35's electronic emissions and stealth characteristics appeared on Russian radar systems, providing Russia with invaluable data on how to detect and engage the aircraft. 6 F-35s already built for Turkey remained in storage at Luke Air Force Base. The United States had not resolved compensation for the $1.4 billion Turkey had paid into the program as of early 2026, though in 2024 the U.S. indicated Turkey could potentially return to the program if it gave up the S-400 systems. Now it is time to go back to the very beginning, more than 40 years before the fires over Tehran. To understand how the F-35 came to be, you have to understand the military and political world of the early 1980s, and the long chain of programs, cancellations, mergers, and technological leaps that eventually produced the most expensive and arguably most capable tactical aircraft ever built. The F-35's lineage begins not with a single program but with a collision of military requirements that took years to resolve into a coherent development path. In 1983, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency initiated the Advanced Short Takeoff and Vertical Landing Program, known by the acronym ASTOVL. The program's mission was to investigate whether the principle behind the AV-8B Harrier, a jet aircraft that could take off and land without a conventional runway, could be extended to a supersonic stealthy platform. The Harrier, for all its revolutionary operational flexibility, was deeply limited as a combat aircraft. It was subsonic, which meant it could not run down a faster adversary or escape pursuit. It had a limited payload, which reduced its strike effectiveness. Its range was short, and the vectored thrust system it used for vertical flight made the aircraft extremely demanding to fly, with a margin for pilot error that was smaller than virtually any other fixed-wing combat aircraft. The Marines loved it because it could operate from ships too small for conventional aircraft and from forward bases without runways, but they knew the next generation had to be better. Under a classified subprogram of ASTOVL called the Supersonic STOVL Fighter, Lockheed's Skunk Works organization began developing concepts for what such an aircraft might look like. The Skunk Works had an unparalleled track record of innovative aircraft design. It had produced the U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that overflew the Soviet Union in the 1950s, the State Route 71 Blackbird that set records for speed and altitude that remain unbroken today, and the F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft. Bringing that intellectual tradition to the STOVL problem, the Skunk Works team began exploring different approaches to achieving vertical lift in a supersonic aircraft. The fundamental tension in designing STOVL combat aircraft is that the features needed for high combat performance work against the features needed for vertical flight. A small, light aircraft with powerful engines can hover more easily, but small aircraft carry less fuel, fewer weapons, and simpler avionics. A large, capable combat aircraft is too heavy to hover without an enormously powerful lift system. Finding the right balance between these competing demands drove the conceptual work of the mid-1980s. The Skunk Works explored several lift system concepts. One was a direct lift system in which engine exhaust was redirected downward. Another was a dedicated lift engine, a separate small turbine specifically for vertical flight. A third, which Lockheed's team found particularly promising, was the shaft-driven lift fan, a large fan mechanically connected to the main engine through a drive shaft and clutch, drawing its power from the main engine rather than burning its own fuel. This configuration avoided the weight and complexity of a separate lift engine while keeping the main engine's exhaust nozzle relatively simple compared to the Harrier's complex four-nozzle vectoring system. Meanwhile, the broader defense landscape was changing in ways that would eventually shape the entire Joint Strike Fighter program. The Reagan administration's defense buildup of the early 1980s had funded an ambitious portfolio of new weapon systems. But by the late 1980s, budget pressure was building. The Air Force was developing the F-22 Advanced Tactical Fighter, which would become the most expensive fighter program in history at the time. The Navy was developing the A-12 Avenger II carrier attack aircraft under a classified program. The Marines needed their Harrier replacement. Developing three separate advanced aircraft programs simultaneously was going to strain the defense budget severely. Program managers and policy officials began thinking about whether there was a way to combine requirements into fewer, more affordable programs. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 accelerated this process dramatically. Overnight, the existential threat that had justified the enormous expense of the F-22 program, the A-12 program, and numerous other Cold War-driven development efforts had evaporated. The Pentagon faced enormous pressure to reduce defense spending. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney canceled the A-12 Avenger II in January 1991, citing cost overruns and technical failures, a decision that left the Navy without a next-generation carrier strike aircraft, and that sparked years of litigation between the government and the program's contractors. The multi-role fighter program, which the Air Force had been pursuing as an affordable F-16 replacement, was scaled back and eventually terminated as the F-22 consumed available procurement funding. The Navy's follow-on advanced attack fighter effort was also killed. Within a few years of the Cold War's end, essentially every major near-term tactical aircraft replacement program had been canceled, leaving the military flying aging aircraft and facing an uncertain path to modernization. Into this gap in 1993 came the Joint Advanced Strike Technology Program, which was managed by a program office in the Pentagon rather than by any individual service. JAST was explicitly a study program, not a development program. Its mandate was to investigate whether a single aircraft family could economically meet the diverse needs of all three military services. The Air Force needed an affordable replacement for the F-16 and eventually the A-10. The Marine Corps needed a supersonic, stealthy successor to the AV-8B Harrier that could operate from amphibious ships and forward bases. The Navy needed a complementary aircraft to the F/A-18 Super Hornet that could penetrate heavily defended targets the Super Hornet could not safely reach. The timing coincided with the maturation of the ASTOVL technology program, which by 1993 had been renamed the Common Affordable Lightweight Fighter and had progressed far enough to demonstrate that the shaft-driven lift fan approach was technically feasible. In 1994, recognizing that CAF and JAST were working toward closely aligned goals, the two programs were merged under the JAST name. The combined program inherited CAF's STOVL technology development and JAST's broad multi-service requirement framework. Concept studies were conducted by Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. In 1995, JAST was renamed the Joint Strike Fighter, a name that captured the program's ambition, a single strike fighter platform serving all three military services jointly, produced in variant-specific configurations that shared enough common components to generate significant economies of scale. The program's core concept was that if the Air Force's F-35A, the Marine Corps' F-35B, and the Navy's F-35C all shared the same engine, the same avionics, the same radar, the same data links, the same weapons, and the same maintenance infrastructure, the total cost of developing, producing, and sustaining those three aircraft would be substantially less than the combined cost of three separate programs. The cost savings would come from shared development expenses, larger combined production runs that reduced per-unit manufacturing costs, shared spare parts inventories that reduced the quantity of parts that needed to be stocked, and simplified training because maintainers could work on any variant. International partnerships were a defining feature of the program from the beginning. The United Kingdom had been involved in the ASTOVL research efforts since the program's early days, bringing British experience with the Harrier to the technical discussions. When the JSF program solidified in the mid-1990s, the UK committed as the sole Tier 1 partner, contributing approximately $200 million to the concept demonstration phase alone, and eventually committing to roughly 10% of total development costs. This investment gave the UK the highest level of technology access and industrial workshare of any international partner, with British companies including BAE Systems producing major structural components, ejector seats, targeting lasers, and weapon release systems. British industry accounts for approximately 15% of the total value of each F-35, making it the largest supplier of F-35 content outside the United States. Italy, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia, Denmark, Norway, and Turkey joined as Tier 2 and Tier 3 partners, collectively contributing $4.375 billion to development costs. The international structure created a production base of extraordinary scale, with the United States planning to buy 2 456 aircraft, the UK planning 138, and dozens more from other partners and foreign military sales customers. The total production run promised to be large enough to drive the per-unit cost well below what any single-nation program could achieve. In November 1996, with the concept study phase complete, the Defense Department selected two companies to build competing concept demonstrator aircraft, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing each received a contract to build prototype aircraft that would fly and demonstrate the key technologies, particularly the ASTOVL system, in actual flight before one was selected to proceed to system development and demonstration. Lockheed Martin's entry was designated the X-35. Boeing's was the X-32. The Boeing X-32 was in many respects the more conservative of the two designs. It featured a large trapezoidal delta wing with no horizontal tail, a configuration that gave it a broad platform to generate lift across the speed range. The wing was large enough that the aircraft did not need conventional tail surfaces for pitch control, relying instead on elevons along the wing's trailing edge. The Boeing ASTOVL concept used a direct lift system in which engine exhaust was redirected forward and downward through a set of auxiliary nozzles during vertical flight. The X-32A conventional variant flew first and demonstrated satisfactory performance. When the X-32B ASTOVL demonstrator flew, it met the requirements, but questions arose about how much the final production aircraft would differ from the demonstrator due to design refinements that Boeing said would be needed. Lockheed Martin's X-35 was more technically adventurous. The design team, working with Pratt & Whitney on the propulsion system, had settled on the shaft-driven lift fan as the ASTOVL solution. The X-35 airframe was designed around this system, with a fuselage wide enough to house the fan behind the cockpit, while still providing adequate internal volume for fuel and weapons. The X-35A conventional variant flew for the first time on October 24, 2000, at Edwards Air Force Base, with Lockheed test pilot Tom Morgenfeld at the controls. Initial flights focused on envelope expansion, validating handling characteristics, stability, and control across the speed and altitude range. The X-35C carrier variant demonstrator first flew on December 16, 2000, with its larger wing area and modified aerodynamics for carrier approach speeds. Both demonstrators performed well within predictions, building confidence in the design approach. The make-or-break moment came in July 2001, when the X-35B ASTOVL demonstrator was put through its definitive tests. The X-35B had been modified from the X-35A by adding the lift fan behind the cockpit and the three-bearing swivel nozzle below the engine. On July 26, 2001, Lockheed test pilot Simon Hargreaves flew the X-35B on a sortie that accomplished three things in sequence without landing in between: a short takeoff run of less than 500 feet, a brief level supersonic dash, and a vertical landing. No aircraft had ever done all three of those things in a single flight. The shaft-driven lift fan, the three-bearing nozzle, the reaction control system, and all the software that controlled them worked together exactly as designed. The program office called it the hat trick. Lockheed Martin called it a decisive demonstration of technical maturity. Military observers called it the flight that won the contract. In October 2001, the Defense Department announced that Lockheed Martin had won the Joint Strike Fighter competition. Officials described the decision as clear-cut, with the X-35 consistently outperforming the X-32 across the key evaluation criteria. The JSF program entered system development and demonstration, with contracts going to Lockheed Martin for the aircraft and Pratt & Whitney for the engine. The aircraft was officially designated the F-35 Lightning II, a name chosen to honor the P-38 Lightning of World War II, and the English Electric Lightning Interceptor that had served the RAF in the Cold War era. The SDD contract was signed on October 26, 2001. The program's original plan called for completing development and testing by 2012, with the Marine Corps declaring initial operational capability in 2010, the Air Force in 2013, and the Navy in 2015. The total acquisition cost was projected at approximately $200 billion in base year 2002 dollars for two 443 aircraft. Those projections bore essentially no relationship to what actually happened. Weight was the first crisis. The F-35B's ASTOVL system imposed a wide fuselage on all three variants because the lift fan behind the cockpit required internal volume that also drove the fuselage cross-section. The wider fuselage meant more frontal area, more aerodynamic drag, more structural weight, and a heavier aircraft overall. For the F-35B specifically, heavier meant worse hover performance, because the lift system could only generate a fixed amount of downward thrust, and every pound of additional aircraft weight ate into the hover margin. Engineers went through multiple design iterations in the early SDD years to address the weight problem, and each iteration took time and money. In 2004, the program was formally restructured for the first time, acknowledging the schedule slippage and cost growth that had already accumulated primarily because of the F-35B. The decision to build aircraft while still testing them, known as concurrent development and production, or more technically as concurrency, was approved as a way to accelerate the timeline to operational service. The logic was that starting production early would allow the industrial base to build up efficiency sooner, reducing per-unit production costs faster and getting aircraft to the services sooner. The practical consequence was that every time testing revealed a design problem, which, in a program of this complexity, was inevitable and frequent, the fix had to be applied not just to future aircraft but to every aircraft already built. This rework was enormously expensive. By the time the program's peak concurrency years were complete, the cost of retrofitting built aircraft to correct design deficiencies discovered during testing had added billions of dollars to the program's total cost. The sensor fusion software proved to be the most intellectually and technically demanding element of the entire program. Writing software that could integrate the outputs of 6 sensor systems operating on different physical principles, identify correlations between their observations in real time, and produce a single reliable tactical picture under all flight conditions was a challenge that the program's early planners had substantially underestimated. Software delivery milestones consistently slipped. Capabilities that were supposed to be available in early software blocks were pushed to later blocks. Each delay in software delivery delayed the delivery of real combat capability to the fleet, and because the program was paying for aircraft that were waiting for software, each delay also added cost. The helmet-mounted display system added its own crisis to the program's difficulties. The early helmet prototypes had serious latency problems in the distributed aperture system video feed, creating a disorienting visual lag that made the helmet difficult to use in dynamic flight. Beyond the latency, the helmet's display brightness was insufficient in full sunlight conditions, making the symbology difficult to read when it was most needed. The display optics generated excessive heat that created thermal management problems within the confines of a flight helmet. The weight of the helmet, while ultimately within limits, was higher than previous helmets and contributed to neck fatigue on long missions. Each of these problems required engineering solutions that took time and resources to develop and validate. By 2009, the Defense Department's Joint Estimate Team concluded that the program was approximately 30 months behind schedule. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates acted decisively in early 2010, removing the Marine Corps general who had been serving as JSF program manager and withholding $614 million in contractor incentive payments until performance improved. In March 2010, the program formally notified Congress that it had breached the Nunn-McCurdy Act's cost growth thresholds, with average procurement unit costs more than 50% above the original baseline. The program was restructured a third time, with a completely new cost and schedule framework and initial operational capability dates pushed back by several years. In 2012, the government's relationship with Lockheed Martin reached its nadir. The Pentagon's deputy F-35 program manager described it as the worst contractor-government relationship seen in many years of complex acquisition work. Air Force Secretary Michael Donnelly publicly stated that the department had no additional money for further program restructuring. The Pentagon openly threatened to withhold additional funding unless specific technical problems, particularly with the helmet, were resolved on schedule. These were not rhetorical warnings. They reflected genuine alarm at the highest levels of leadership about whether the program could deliver. In 2014, the program's management was publicly criticized, in terms that had rarely been used for any major defense program. Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Frank Kendall, speaking about the decision to begin mass production before testing was complete, called the approach acquisition malpractice. His criticism reflected a considered judgment that the program structure had imposed enormous additional costs on the government that could have been avoided with better planning. It was an extraordinary public rebuke. The three variants eventually reached operational service on schedules that reflected the program's troubled history. The F-35B achieved initial operational capability with the U.S. Marine Corps on July 31, 2015, operating in the Block 2B software configuration that had significant capability limitations compared to full Block 3F combat capability. The declaration was controversial because the Block 2B aircraft had genuine restrictions on night operations, weapons carriage, and mission systems employment. The Air Force declared IOC for the F-35A on August 2, 2016. The Navy's F-35C finally achieved IOC on February 28, 2019, the last of the three variants to reach operational status. By the time the F-35C achieved IOC, it was roughly 4 years behind the original schedule, and the program was approximately 80% over budget. The F-35B made its first overseas deployment in 2017, when Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121 took its aircraft to Marine Corps Air Station Iwakuni, Japan, the first forward deployment of the type outside the continental United States. The following year, the aircraft deployed to the U.S. Fifth Fleet aboard the USS Essex as the air combat element of the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit, and it was in this deployment that the F-35 first went to war in American hands. But the F-35 had already been to war before any American pilot fired a shot with it. That story belongs entirely to Israel. Israel ordered the F-35 in 2010 for reasons that go directly to the heart of Israeli national security. The country has for decades faced an existential security challenge in the potential nuclear weaponization of Iran. Any credible Israeli deterrent option for attacking Iranian nuclear facilities required aircraft capable of penetrating the most sophisticated air defenses in the region, including Russian-supplied S-300 systems that conventional fourth-generation aircraft could not safely enter. The F-35's combination of stealth, sensor capability, and long-range precision strike made it the clear choice for building this capability. Israel signed an initial contract for 20 aircraft with options for more, and eventually placed orders for 50 F-35Is. The first two aircraft landed in Israel on December 12, 2016, at Nevatim Air Base. Israel negotiated a unique arrangement for its variant. The F-35I Adir, using the Hebrew word for mighty, has greater integration of Israeli-developed systems than any other non-U.S. operator's aircraft. Lockheed Martin gave Israel deeper access to the core avionics architecture than any other international customer, enabling the integration of Israeli weapons, Israeli electronic warfare systems, and other Israeli-developed capabilities. Israel also received a dedicated F-35I testbed aircraft for developmental testing of Israeli systems, the only non-U.S. operator to receive such an asset. This depth of integration reflected both the strategic importance of the Israeli relationship to the U.S. and Israel's own sophisticated defense electronics industry. The aircraft's Israeli combat debut came sooner than anyone outside Israel knew at the time. In May 2018, amid escalating tensions between Israel and Iran's military forces in Syria, Israeli Air Force F-35I Adirs flew combat missions against Iranian targets. On May 22, 2018, IAF Commander Major General Amikem Norkin confirmed publicly at the Herzliya conference that Israel had used the F-35I in 2 operational attacks, making Israel the first country in the world to employ the F-35 in combat. He showed photographs of an F-35I flying over Beirut in broad daylight and said the aircraft had been flown, in his words, all over the Middle East. The missions targeted Iranian military installations in Syria in response to an Iranian rocket attack on Israeli positions across the Golan buffer zone. Israeli aircraft struck more than 20 Iranian targets in Syria. Syrian air defense systems fired more than 100 surface-to-air missiles at the Israeli strike package, and Israel destroyed Syrian anti-aircraft batteries in response. The F-35Is, operating in stealth mode with internal weapons, flew through the engagement envelopes of those systems without being successfully tracked and engaged. The aircraft completed their assigned strikes and returned home. The world's first operational use of a fifth-generation stealth fighter demonstrated the fundamental premise of the design. An aircraft with sufficiently low radar cross-section could penetrate modern air defenses that would be lethal to conventional aircraft. The U.S. Marine Corps followed with the first American F-35 combat employment on September 27, 2018. Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 211, the Wake Island Avengers, launched F-35Bs from the deck of the USS Essex in the Arabian Sea. The jets flew a significant distance and struck a Taliban fixed target in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, in support of ground clearance operations. The ground force commander assessed the strike as successful. One of the aircraft carried the name of Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Rabel, a Marine pilot killed in Afghanistan in September 2012 when Taliban fighters attacked Camp Bastion in the most serious attack on a NATO airbase since the Vietnam War. The naming honored a fallen aviator who had led the very squadron now making history. The U.S. Air Force flew its first combat mission with the F-35A on April 27, 2019. Two F-35As struck an Islamic State tunnel network in Wadi Ashai, northern Iraq, in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. The mission demonstrated the Air Force variant's basic combat capability and its integration into the Joint Air Operations architecture, though it did not require the aircraft's stealth features against an adversary with no meaningful air defense. In June 2019, Royal Air Force F-35Bs from No. 617 Squadron, the legendary Dambusters, deployed to RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. On June 25, 2019, at least one F-35B reportedly conducted an armed reconnaissance flight searching for Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria, marking the RAF's first F-35 combat use. The following year, in June 2021, the story expanded dramatically when HMS Queen Elizabeth deployed on her first operational cruise with RAF F-35Bs from 617 Squadron and U.S. Marine Corps F-35Bs from VMFA 211 embarked together. The combined force launched strikes against Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria, marking the first British carrier strike operation since the Libya campaign of 2011, and the first time American aircraft had struck from a British carrier since World War II. March 2021 brought the first F-35 air-to-air engagement. Israeli F-35 shot down two Iranian drones attempting to carry weapons to the Gaza Strip, intercepting them on March 15, 2021. The IDF only confirmed the engagement publicly in January 2022, but the event marked the first time any F-35 had fired air-to-air weapons in an actual intercept, validating the system's air-to-air missile employment against real aerial targets. November 2023 saw the F-35 defend targets far from its home base. During the Gaza conflict following the October 7 Hamas attacks, an Israeli F-35I shot down a Houthi cruise missile over the Red Sea fired from Yemen. The intercept extended Israeli air defense to ranges far beyond the country's borders and demonstrated the aircraft's effectiveness in the active defense role against fast-moving cruise missile targets. Through 2024, the F-35I's operational tempo remained high. Strike missions in Lebanon in August and September 2024 against Hezbollah targets, long-range strikes on Houthi infrastructure in Yemen in September 2024, and the decisive October 2024 strikes inside Iran itself during Operation Days of Repentance all demonstrated an aircraft operating at the limits of its published range and performing missions that no other tactical aircraft in Israeli service could have attempted. The October 2024 Iran strikes deserve particular attention. Over 100 Israeli aircraft penetrated Iranian airspace directly and struck S-300 surface-to-air missile batteries, their engagement radars, and ballistic missile production facilities. The round trip covered approximately 2,000 kilometers. No aircraft were lost. Satellite imagery confirmed the destruction of multiple S-300 engagement radars. This was the mission that Israeli planners had been working towards since the F-35I program began in 2010. The demonstrated ability to enter Iranian airspace, destroy the most capable air defense systems Iran possessed, and exit without loss. The strategic message was unmistakable. June 2025 brought the F-35 into the American pre-war campaign against Iran's nuclear program in Operation Midnight Hammer. US F-35As worked ahead of B-2 bombers, drawing and defeating Iranian surface-to-air missile fire and creating corridors for the bombers to reach their targets. Iran's nuclear infrastructure was struck. The technology and tactics validated in that operation became the foundation for Operation Epic Fury. And then came February 28, 2026, the operation that the F-35 had been designed for. Not a strike against Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan. Not a patrol over a counterinsurgency theater where the skies were empty of threats. The full weight of Iranian integrated air defense, engineered over decades with Russian assistance and indigenous Iranian innovation, arrayed against an American and Israeli air campaign of unprecedented scale. The result was not perfect. One F-35 took a hit severe enough to force an emergency landing after 19 days of combat. But thousands of other sorties were flown, targets were destroyed throughout Iran, air supremacy was established over Tehran, and the first air-to-air kill by the aircraft type in a war against a modern adversary was achieved in beyond visual range combat with a guided missile, exactly as designed. The story of the F-35 Lightning II is ultimately a story about what it costs to remain the most capable air force in the world, when potential adversaries have access to advanced radar systems, sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, and increasingly capable passive sensors that do not care how small your radar cross-section is. Building an aircraft that can operate in that environment, that can absorb hits from advanced radars and not be found, absorb hits from passive infrared seekers, and survive long enough to complete the mission, and share everything it learns in real time with every friendly platform in the battlespace, required 3 decades, hundreds of billions of dollars, the engineering genius of thousands of people, and the political will to keep funding the program through every failure and every scandal. The aircraft that emerged from that process is not perfect, its operating costs are extraordinarily high, its stealth is less effective against passive infrared systems than its designers hoped, its combat radius in some configurations is shorter than ideal for Pacific scenarios. Its software, even at Block 4, represents a system that will require continuous update and upgrade throughout its operational life to remain relevant against evolving threats. The program management was genuinely dysfunctional at points during development, costing the taxpayer billions of dollars that better management might have saved. But the combat record is also real. Syria in 2018, Afghanistan in 2018, Iraq in 2019, Lebanon repeatedly, Yemen repeatedly, Iran in 2024, Venezuela in 2026, Iran again in 2026, on a scale and intensity that would have been unimaginable when the first F-35I touched down at Nevatim in December 2016. The aircraft has consistently done what it was designed to do. It has penetrated air defenses that would have been lethal to legacy aircraft. It has put precision weapons on target in the most contested airspace in the world. It has shared the resulting intelligence picture with every other platform in the Joint Force Network. And it has done all of this at a rate of thousands of sorties per week in the most intense air campaign America has conducted in a generation. When the last F-35 is retired from service, sometime in the middle decades of this century, or perhaps as late as 2070, it will have been in continuous combat operations for over half a century. The pilots who fly the final F-35 sorties have not yet been born. The threats those pilots will face, and the conflicts in which they will fly, cannot yet be predicted. What can be predicted is that the aircraft they fly will still carry the APG-81 radar, or its upgraded successor, still project the world around them onto a helmet visor, still carry precision weapons in internal bays that preserve its stealth, and still share everything it sees in real time with every allied platform on the network. The almost invisible fighter, the machine that changed air combat, the 30-year argument about whether it was worth building. The answer, written in the skies over Tehran in 2026, is yes. The F-35 Lightning II,